Hello, innovators. I'm Todd Wyant, and welcome to the Bridging the Gap podcast presented by Great Tech Group. You're invited to join our conversation to model the future of construction innovation and the digital transformation adventure of this great industry. My guest today is Ben Glunz. He's an architect turned technologist and the founder and CEO of Anguleris, a global leader in construction technology with a passion for bridging the gap between building product manufacturers and AEC professionals. Ben spearheaded the development of BIMsmith, an industry-leading product research and specification platform, and Swatchbox, the leading material sample platform for architects and designers. Welcome to the show, Ben. So I always like to start with how you got into the construction industry to begin with. What's kind of your origin story into it?
Yeah, I am actually the fourth generation in my family to be in the building industry. So long line of contractors, architects, and so on. And so I guess both entrepreneurship and the construction industry run pretty thick in my blood. So proud to carry that on in a first century kind of way.
Yeah, that's awesome. Was there anything growing up that was like, yeah, that's definitely the path for me. I want to continue on the legacy?
Yeah, I think for me, it was wanting to find a way to drive design was always very high on my interest radar. Early childhood development with things like Legos probably tipped my parents off that might be a good starting point for me. But then always being interested in design and art and all of those connections was always something really high on my radar. It was a pretty natural choice for me to pursue architecture when I went off to school.
So what inspired the transition from designing buildings to building a business?
Yeah, so the transition from being an architect to running a tech company is certainly an interesting one. And for me, it was realizing pretty quickly after a certain number of years in practice that I could only impact so much change in that role. And kind of signature not patient person in terms of wanting to see things happen and be able to impact change. And so I saw a path where I could actually move the needle a lot faster and decided to give that a shot. At first as a side hustle. My co-founder and I both worked at a firm and did this type of work on the side for the first 2 years and then went full time with it. And that's when it really took off. Really to answer the question, it came down to how much impact can we have and how do we get there faster?
Yeah, love that. So looking back, how did the architectural background, how that helped shape your approach to entrepreneurship?
Yeah, all of what we build at Anguleris is rooted in our experience as architects. And so you have this really well-aligned authenticity statement that comes down to each tool that we build. Would we have used this when we were in practice? And our goal is to make it that when someone tries one of our tools for the first time, they're pulling their friend from across the office over to, hey, you need to check this out. And it has to meet that sniff test in order for us to take it out to the marketplace. And so it's rooted in that authenticity, but then becomes a very natural extension once it actually gets out in the world.
Yeah. So what were the challenges then that you were trying to, really bring with scale into the construction, help address into the construction industry that you really felt compelled to address to shift over and come into the tech side?
The first area that we set our hands to as Anguleris was the problem around BIM and manufacturers. Going back to 2010, a lot of manufacturers were not even aware that such a shift had occurred from AutoCAD to Revit. And my co-founder and I were both BIM managers, very early adopters of Revit, talking 5 or so years after the product came out and helping firms make that transition. So we saw the potential, we saw what was happening, and we realized that the manufacturers were just completely missing this new opportunity that they had to serve the architects in a new way, beyond just, can I update your spec? Can I give you samples? Can I come give you a lunch and learn? There was this whole new category of a way to engage between architects and manufacturers. And so we tested that problem statement on some manufacturers who came in to give us lunch and learns and things like that. We would sort of cleverly ask what they were doing about Revit. And of course, they would flop about a little bit and then say, well, we can help you. And those were some of our early pitches. And that's kind of a funny way to start, but that was the first problem we set out to solve, is connecting the manufacturer and the architect through a BIM workflow.
Yeah. How did you go about the mindset shift needed to bring about that change management to help connect those two stakeholders together that didn't typically work together in the way that you're talking about here?
Yeah, it is a shift, and it still is a shift to this day when manufacturers think about getting serious about a BIM strategy. And I think in some ways it might even be harder now because so many manufacturers think they understand what a good BIM strategy is, but ultimately they're not talking to their end audience in terms of architects. They're not building relationships there, and they're not, in some cases, they've never even seen their Revit files, we find. So you might have a manufacturer who's had content for years, and we open it up with them for the first time, and they're shocked at what they see. And so what we work with our customers on is moving it from a check in the box as, yeah, we've got Revit, to this is an actual strategy and how we're going to take this product to market.
Yeah, so more defining the terms at the beginning and making sure everybody's on the same page there with how you're talking.
Very much so.
Yeah. So on that line, can you explain the circular sampling and how is this going to differ from the traditional kind of material sampling methods?
Sure. Spun off of everything we built with BIMsmith in 2019, we launched Swatchbox as another problem statement, which was the sampling industry is sort of broken. And so Swatchbox has evolved and grown ever since then to becoming one of the premier sampling platforms worldwide. Even still, we felt that we hadn't closed the loop in terms of sampling. And so that's really where Second Life samples came into play. We did an exhibition at Milan Design Week in 2024, and then formally launched Second Life samples in London in 2025, so this spring. And the whole premise there is we're closing the loop from ordering samples to where do the samples go after the project is complete. And what a lot of people don't realize is much of sample consumption is project oriented. And so what happens is at the end of the project, that sample is still there. And so what we found is a lot of firms, it just piles up and stacks up and nobody knows what to do with it because nobody wants to throw it away. A lot of the manufacturers will not come get it. Ultimately, recycling can be too much of a lift for the specialty streams of different materials, whether that's concrete or rubber or carpet. It's all a different approach. So it's just not practical for firms to do anything other than what they do, which is rent a dumpster and every quarter clean it out. Or worse, continue paying rent on larger and larger sample libraries that have outdated products in them. And so what we did is created an entire network on the back of the existing Swatchbox logistics to be able to say to any firm, anywhere, if you request a Swatchbox tote, a pickup tote, we'll accept samples whether they came from us or not. And what we do from there is we're sorting them, we're grading them, we're checking them to make sure there's still products in circulation, but ultimately, about 90% of what we can collect can actually go back up onto Swatchbox Pro, which is the site where these products are made available. And so it really does create the first circular sampling program in the world because we're taking all of it, not just what we're producing, and we're getting it back into the architect's hands for its originally intended use, which is, in our mind, much better than recycling because recycling even has a carbon footprint to it versus reuse. You're actually preventing the stock from getting cut to make more samples. You're actually reducing the waste. You're reducing the raw material that has to be cut up for new samples. By bringing it back into its originally intended use, it's a bit of a step up from what we can even do with recycling.
Yeah, that's very cool. What are some of the barriers that you've encountered when introducing this concept?
Well, firstly, we had to build out the logistics. So making sure that we had a good system to make sure everything was current. That was something we had to do because we can't have things that are out of circulation out there. And we do have a great program where we take those ones that have been discontinued and we ship those to design schools. Because they still have the need for samples. They don't care if it's a current product or not. There's a lot of demand there. So it even then gets another use. But we had to overcome that. We had to overcome the logistical barriers of being able to schedule pickups across the nation and even internationally in our other international markets where we are. So once we had that set up, really at that point, it's how do we get the word out there fast enough? And so we literally had hundreds of firms sign up within the first few weeks of the launch, and it hasn't slowed down since then. So it's really not a sell that we have to go in and do with firms, or we weren't even sure how would manufacturers take this, but many manufacturers are even interested in partnering with us to be able to do that. So it's been a huge success across the board, and who knows where we'll go from here.
Yeah. It sounds like a cool ride so far this year. What are the technical innovations that are underpinning all of this?
Yeah, so obviously our internal system that we use to make this all happen logistically had to be upgraded and done. The other thing, our grading system is actually powered by an AI tool that uses photography and real-time video to help us search for defects. So when we're grading fabric swatches, for example, we can detect nicks or loops, samples that need to be rejected or sent to universities. So it gives us a higher standard of quality, which is paramount to the trust that we have with the firms who are ordering samples that are coming back to them. They still need to be in that pristine condition. So we've utilized the best of first century tech to help make this possible, because I don't know that even 10 years ago, the volume and the processing that are required would have been possible without the tech that we've built.
Yeah, for sure. When we talk tech, especially in the last 10 years here in construction, it's truly mind-blowing how fast the technology has really evolved. I mean, it's breakneck speed. Are there other areas in construction that you think are really ripe for kind of this sustainable innovation?
I think somebody's got to fix contract docs. We need to see acceleration of the modernization of the architect's business model. That has got to be fixed. And if we don't fix that, the profession will continue to struggle. And so it's my hope that across all the different stakeholders that are in the industry, we find a way to get away from hours for money as a means to fuel the architecture and construction economy, and get more outcome based in terms of the approach and how architects get paid for their time. Because ultimately, they'll get engineered out of the equation. If it's just time and I can do my job in 10 minutes, what do you care if it took me 10 minutes or 10 hours? If the outcome is there, it comes down to the knowledge and the problem solving that architects bring to the table. That's the secret sauce. It's not literally how many interns do I have grinding out in the office on Revit. It's about the problem solving and ultimately the end result, which is a better building. So that is something that I hope the industry will take very seriously in the coming months and years. And I'm hoping that there are groups that are moving that forward.
Yeah. How do you think you go about that shift in perspective?
Well, I think there are other industries who have already figured this out. Software development, graphic design, you see outcome-based pricing. I will design you a website for $15,000 or $50,000, whatever it is. If you do that in 10 minutes, no one's going to know. But ultimately, it's value for money in that. Graphic design is another one. You see the rise of tools out there that you can go buy a logo, you can go buy a business card for a set price. Mm-hmm. I think there are plenty of other industries who have done this effectively. I think lawyers are in for the same probably outcome, honestly. They're going to have to figure that out as well in terms of having fixed bid pricing and outcome-based pricing. I think there are areas of the medical field who have figured this out and certain areas who haven't. But any of the professions are going to have to look to this and see what's working in the spaces that have successfully navigated that transition.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting topic for sure, especially when you bring in AI into the equation, because that's going to totally, hopefully, speed things up. That's the promise, and get you more efficient. So it's going to reduce that time needed to do it. So if you're charging on hours, that whole model is flipped up on its head when just in general. But then as you bring in AI, it really just totally changes the equation and the dynamics.
Yeah, and for all of these professions, the value driven and the value created will be around the discernment of the output.
Yeah.
right? Before I ship the documents off for permit, it's my review that's ultimately going to say whether that's right or wrong. And I think people who are using AI most effectively are the ones who are iterating, not just taking that first output that it rattles off. And you can tell who's doing that and who's using it in a more strategic way. And so as of now, that's not something that's replaced. That could get replaced as well, that it gets that good. But even still, understanding and optimizing that is a real skill.
Yeah, for sure. Introducing disruptive innovation in what is a more traditional industry like AEC is always challenging. How'd you approach the task of coming in and introducing the new innovation and new tech while being respectful of that kind of tradition of it, but saying, hey, here's a better way to go about it?
I think we have to think of it as it's a jetpack, not a replacement. That's the first fallacy, is that somehow it's just there's not going to be any humans involved. I mean, in some places that will certainly be true, but in the end, I always think the collaboration is going to be better regardless. So as we introduce that technology, that's a common talk track for us, is that, look, this is meant to take the drudgery out of your workplace.
Yeah. How do you measure then the success of innovation?
Success of innovation is when we look back 5 years later and say, can you believe we were doing it that way? That to me is always the benchmark on any software or innovation, right? And you look at 10 years of the iPhone or 10 years of cloud computing, and in some cases it seems unthinkable. I was in a home recently that had a wall-mounted intercom that goes down to the front door, and it was on multiple levels of the home, and this thing was huge and clunky and it had knobs, and I'm like, when was this house built? And they're like, 2006. And I'm like, in 2006 we were hardwiring intercoms into our home. Like, that's ridiculous. Like, you would never do that today. I mean, you might, but it would look totally different. So coming back to AEC, like, look at something like Revit and go back, however many years, and it's shocking to say, can you believe we were actually drafting lines and arcs in AutoCAD? And I think the same learning curve will be, or innovation curve will be there for the way we think about AI. I mean, can you imagine that in 2021, only a fraction of the world had ever heard the name OpenAI, and it was mostly technophiles that were studying all of this, but then something pivoted there in that December of 22, and suddenly the whole world knew and understood the potential of AI. That's not that long ago.
Right.
For all intents and purposes, 2 or 3 years ago. And so when you think of the way the flywheel spins, that to me is the success of innovation, is when you look back and can't believe you did something a certain way over a defined period of time.
Yeah. I mean, I think that the speed of AI right now, if you're looking out 20 years ahead, we don't even know how the changes are going to impact, because the speed is changing so fast. Just looking out from where we were even a year ago is pretty drastic in the changes of the workflows and the tools and just the scope that it can happen. So it's evolving so fast right now that even in 10 years, I think you look back and it's a pretty dramatic. Well, we were doing that 10 years ago, so it's an interesting thing. Are there certain metrics or feedback mechanisms that you have in place, or you like to look to assess the impact on sustainability and industry practices?
Yeah, with the Second Life program, we're primarily measuring the number of samples we've diverted from the landfill. That's a very straightforward success metric that you can't fake and you can't hype. And to date, since we launched the program, we're well over 50,000 samples that we've diverted from the landfill. And we feel pretty great about that. And we're just warming up. So that impact will only continue to accelerate. And we're going to continue to pursue that. And so that then goes downstream into how the manufacturers design their samples, knowing that is what's going to become the norm. How do you make it more durable? How do you make it more protectable as it's getting beaten around a job site? So there are best practices that are even emerging from what we're finding that is weathering versus is getting beaten up and not usable. And so that data set alone is then looping back and thereby making that industry more sustainable.
Yeah. Interesting. So we were just chatting about the kind of the 20-year vision. So looking ahead, what's your vision for the future of, sustainable practices in construction, and how do you see the industry evolving to meet emerging challenges or opportunities that will present itself?
My biggest hope in that space is that sustainability and capitalism converge, where the interest of the building owner is in alignment with ultimately the sustainability goals. And then also for, what I'll jokingly call the sustainability lobby, that we can get coalesced around a set of principles that doesn't need to change every year. It seems that every year there's a new set of interesting things to pursue. And I think we've come a long way since LEED first hit the world, in the early 2000s. We've come a long way to get away from gizmo green, but in some ways it's still out there. And I still think there are fundamental principles that are kind of old world ways of being sustainability that are still overlooked. Like, for example, the most sustainable building is the building that you don't tear down and rebuild every 50 years. But in some ways, you look at the way the banks have perpetuated depreciation-based incentives for tearing down buildings, and to an extent, the tax codes, support that as well. In a world where we tear down a McDonald's just because it's 20 years old, to me, that completely dilutes other sustainable choices and impacts we're having. So we have to get real about a holistic approach to sustainability and get past just some of the feel-good monikers that we talk about, because otherwise it's not going to have the impact that I think we all want. So my hope is that those two interests, the interest of the owner and the interest of our world, converge. And I think at that point, we'll see some real traction. But until then, there are very few people talking about sustainability from a holistic perspective. But there are some out there. One author that I love to read is Steve Mouzon, who wrote The Original Grain. And he's really been the expert on that holistic approach to sustainability. And I think that's something that we really have to take seriously in the next 10 to 20 years.
Yeah. I think it's a great point that you bring up there on the holistic approach to get all the priorities and the arrows, aims kind of focus in the same direction and not being just, counteracting each other and just running around in circles. So is there a particular piece of advice that you would give architects and designers kind of eager to contribute, do their part in the sustainability effort and maybe help align those arrows?
I'd say first thing, educate yourself in accounting. I wish there were more architect MBAs out there who understand the business side of it. And I've had the pleasure, even with our own warehouses and facilities, of being the architect and owner, which has really changed my perspective in terms of understanding how deals are financed, how deals are put together. And so understanding the client, your end target, a lot better, coming from a business and accounting perspective, I'd say that's one part. But then ultimately, being the change you want to see is something that always pops into my head, which is, famously attributed to Gandhi. Being the change you want to see, actually rolling up your sleeves and doing something, goes far more than standing in an ivory tower and pointing out over the horizon. I personally wish we had more folks who are rolling up their sleeves and moving the needle. So hopefully, as we free up people from the drudgery of AI, it does free up people to actually think and design and dream and have that impact that we all always dream of having.
Right. And I think it will. I mean, that's the promise, at least, of AI, is that it takes off the mundane task to free you up for the more strategic and creative thinking. So hopefully that, is coming more and more into fruition every day. So as we wrap, a couple of rapid fire questions for you. First, what is the phrase modeling the future? What does that mean and look like to you?
Sure. I think we have to think of everything we do in terms of architecture as we are literally shaping the built environment, which then shapes our lives. And that's a classic Winston Churchill quote, we shape our buildings and then our buildings shape us. And so the opportunity we have through the built environment to shape our society is huge. So modeling that, of course, from a physical sense is really important, that we take that responsibility as architects very seriously. But then as humans, modeling the future, I think, to our children is in some ways even more important. The way that we model our lives and the way we build our lives, our kids look to that and they'll remember that. And I think in every aspect, there's an opportunity to be that model for the next generation coming up, whether that's your kids or whether that's the interns in the office, that you're modeling, a better architectural profession. So I think there's two approaches there.
Yeah. Well said. What does innovation mean to you?
Innovation is the chance to translate a dream to value. I think ultimately that's really what it comes down to is, can you create value for society, and can you create value for your fellow man or for your shareholders or whatever that looks like through the tokenization of value, which is money. But ultimately that's something we talk about all the time. It's not necessarily about the money, though of course that's a measuring stick. But converting a dream, a concept to an idea in today's world, the execution is very important. And so bridging that gap from a dream to actual value creation for someone is ultimately what you have to do through innovation.
Yeah. Well said. Yeah, and very well done on tying in the name of the podcast into the answer too on innovation. That was well done. I saw what you did there. How do people find out more information and connect with you?
The best place to reach me is on LinkedIn. Please send me a request, put in the note that you heard me on the podcast, and I'd love to connect with you and potentially collaborate any way we can.
Awesome. Well, final question for you, Ben. If I could give you all construction power and you could snap your fingers and innovate one thing in the industry, what would you pick to innovate?
I think it would be the thing I talked about earlier, making the migration from time for money to value-based value creation for the architecture industry. I think if we could solve that, you'd have architects that are able to have a much more sustainable business. And then the outcome from that is then they can be focused on driving innovation in the built environment rather than just grinding through the next job and making the next payroll, which I think a lot of firms have to live payroll to payroll. And, I look at the ABI, the Architectural Billings Index, and it goes like this, and it always has. And it's, how do you build a business on that? It's honestly kind of concerning when I look at that. And so if we could get to a world where architects could do what they do best, which is solving problems, I think if we could get to a world where architects could focus on that, I think you'd see change a lot faster and a lot of really great outcomes for our world.
I like it. Ben, thanks so much for taking the time and joining the show today.
Thanks for having me, Todd.
And now it's time for my Todd takes from this episode. First take, legacy can spark innovation. Deep roots in construction don't have to lock us into old ways. They can be the spark for new ideas. When experience meets curiosity, it creates the foundation to reimagine how the industry works and to move it forward in bold ways. Take 2. Circularity beats recycling. Sustainability goes beyond recycling. A circular approach prevents waste before it starts by keeping resources in use and extending their life cycle. It's about building smarter systems that maximize value while minimizing impact. And finally, innovation should feel like a jetpack, not a replacement. The best technology doesn't replace people, it empowers them. Innovation should remove the drudgery, free up creativity, and accelerate progress. When disruption feels like a jetpack instead of a threat, that's when real transformation happens. Thanks for listening to this episode. If you are interested in learning more, you can visit our sponsor, Great Tech Group, at asti.com for more information. You can listen to this podcast anytime by simply going to Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Also, be sure to check out our website, bridgingthegappod.com. As always, I'm Todd Wyant, thanking you for joining the conversation to model the future on the Bridging the Gap podcast. Keep innovating.